Hello, and welcome to the Distinction podcast. Today, we'll be analysing Dunn and Holt's qualitative investigation on personal disclosure, mutual sharing, team building activity, whilst also critically analysing PDMS as an intervention in sports psychology. Firstly, Elliot, tell me about the aims and hypothesis.
Yeah, so the hypothesis is, does a personal disclosure, mutual sharing, or PDMS team building activity have a positive effect on the actual overarching team cohesion and understanding of each other? That was also one of the main aims, is to create a better team cohesion throughout a team building task, where ideally all the players should have a better understanding of themselves and of their peers and teammates and the roles that they play in each other's game. And another aim is the purpose of the study was to examine and analyse athletes' objective response to a team building process, whether they liked it or didn't like it, basically.
So there's 27 hockey players. They were all aged 22 and they all took part in Dunn and Holt's 2003 study. So data was also reported and it was obtained from the same interviews conducted in the 2003 study. It took the interviews were taken 2 weeks after the national tournament. Players were asked to participate in semi-structured tape-recorded interviews, which were conducted by a final year sports psychologist PhD student. All athletes completed standard informal consent, and interviews lasted between 30 minutes to an hour, and all data was transcribed by the interview and was coded to ensure athletes' anonymity.
Pete, how did they implement this intervention?
So the 2-year sports psychologist asked all members of the team to bring an emotional story to their session, which was set before, I think it was a couple of days before their match for their tournament they were going to. The captains were given the first and last speaking positions, as the psychologist was most comfortable with them and knew what they were most likely to say. And each member of the group would share their personal story with the other members of the group over the course of this session. For this session, it took too long and they had to stretch out over a second session the next day.
So from the data, they pulled out two sort of key themes: the perceptions of the meetings and the perceived benefits. The key titles and themes that appeared throughout the perceptions of the meetings was apprehension prior to the meeting, so before having the meeting, which might have caused some anxiety towards the actual championship games that they had. The emotional intensity, how strong all the stories were and how they sort of touched the people who were involved in the conversations. The significant life experiences, so this being an experience that they'll never forget, and the sports psychologist setting the tone, so setting a strong story to start with. The perceived benefits which arised from the results were an understanding of one another and teammates. Some people felt they had greater cohesion, and the confidence of the team mostly felt that it arose. So, Sophie, what are the key takeaways from this paper?
So, looking at the results, obviously it was good. It worked and had a very strong effect on team cohesion. However, it was very specific. The team had already used a similar type of intervention, so they were already used to it. And we can't really generalize it to all teams. There was a systematic analysis done by Warburton et al., and they found that interventions like this for team cohesion were only recommended for highly committed and mature athletes. Kwon in 2024 agreed with this, as he found that methods to improve team cohesion actually worked better for athletes who were between the age of 15 and 20 and performed at quite a high level, so a collegiate team level. So again, it's just not very generalizable. And it's important to remember that. Other team cohesion methods may be better, more favourable. So For example, Madsen and Burns used similar techniques to the personal disclosure, mutual sharing, team building activity. It's kind of the same idea, but it was a lot less intense. It was more of just a questionnaire, like reflecting on how they and the team work together. And they found that it kept them really accountable, it helped them understand what a good team is, but without the strong emotional like fatigue that you would get from sharing an emotionally intense story pretty regularly with your team.
So, like you mentioned there's quite a few different strengths and limitations to this paper. We're going to explore them further later on. But Pete, can you tell me, to start with, what scenario do you think would be ideal to introduce PDMS?
Well, it's quite a specific intervention. It's very it requires a lot of preconditions, especially with the team needs to know each other quite well. They need to be able to express their emotions quite well. So it requires a somewhat mature person. But also, as Sophie's pointed out with the Warburton study, this kind of intervention works best for people under the age of 20. So there's a middle ground where you end up with college teams or maybe late secondary school teams, that sort of age where they'll have been playing together for a while because they'll come up through the same school or maybe even through the same academy league or something together. So they already know each other quite well, and you might, if you're a psychologist for the whole club or for that team as you follow it through, you might have the same amount of experience with them because this requires a lot of experience with the team. The team has to have a lot of experience with each other, and they have to be old enough to be able to take it seriously. So for its late teens, early 20s, college level teams, effectively, which is quite a specific scenario. You might be able to branch it out to other scenarios, but you probably have to deconstruct it and do either a less intense version or accept that the results of it won't be as impactful.
So we know that the nature of a sports psychologist is often we don't tend to have a job for a long period of time sometimes, and sometimes it's not the most stable position. Do you think that would have an effect on being able to introduce PDMS even at that sort of early 20s level?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as mentioned in this study, there was the advantage that this psychologist had been with the team for 2 years, and they pointed out the regular interactions that the psychologist had with the team. So they were very comfortable with the players, very comfortable with the coaching staff. The players trusted the psychologist. Wouldn't work if you were to go straight into a new team. It would just no one would take it seriously. No one would trust you. No one would accept anything. It would probably cause adverse effects from players feeling embarrassed or the additional apprehension. And again, these players specifically, a lot of them still reported feeling apprehension about this task, despite being on a team where this kind of activity was done semi-regularly. They had to do public speaking semi-regularly as part of the team process, and still doing this was considered quite apprehensive. But what was it? I think it was just under half of the people who reported it. So for a group that doesn't have any experience, you're just going to cause more harm than good.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Let's say we're in an ideal world. How do you ideal world where we have been with a team for a long time? How would you go about introducing this, Elliot, as a theory or an intervention?
So, like what Pete said, there has to be a team that's been together for a while. One good example that I found was actually from a paper called Sports Psychology in Practice by Anderson, 2005. There was a match United played where they said that in the final he had all the starting 11 players walk into his office a week before the big game, and individually he asked them about a personal story of their childhood or where they grew up or their problems. And then the game of the final in the changing room, he actually said to all the starting 11s about all their different pasts and chose similarities between all of them to try and get a better team cohesion and togetherness. But the main thing is that they were together for at least 6 or 7 years before that. And some of the players were described as saying that They saw Ferguson as a father figure, and that it was a massive team cohesion and almost like a family. Whether that's ethically good or not to have an individual tell you about a certain part of their past and then without their consent tell the whole team. It worked on the day because they won the game, but whether that's ethical or not, that's something to debate, which we can go into further.
As you mentioned, ethics is something that we get taught at this master's level from quite heavily. So it is definitely a consideration. And I think that's a really key example, which links quite nicely to the paper as well. Thinking ethically about PDMS in general or using those personal stories is definitely something ethically that might be controversial. So having conversations with the team or sharing with the team, we don't know what to expect. We don't know what to expect in terms of if a conversation could be particularly triggering to a different player and if that could maybe affect player performance potentially. How do you think, what do you think of Alex Ferguson and do you think he was ethical in the way that he went about his team cohesion activity?
I thought it was. I disagree with the ethical standpoint. Even though the players described him as a father, everyone is an individual at the end of the day, and some of the starting 11 will obviously the starting 11 will together for a few years, but I don't think it's ethically correct to have someone give their trust and give a personal story and then just tell all the rest of the players. Like, yeah, all the players might have enjoyed working with him and seen him as a father figure, but there could be some cliques or some teammates that don't like each other and they don't want that player to know about their past. Or so it was a very ethically wrong thing to do, I think, personally.
I think that this is an example. Ferguson uses it as an example of like how to make it smaller, obviously in an unethical way, but a way to like take what is quite a bulky intervention that takes 2 days and everyone's talking to make it smaller and still have it have, at least as described in the studies, some effect.
Yeah. And I think as psychologists, we need to bear in mind that we need to keep our barriers as well, or know our limitations of our roles. So as a coach, Sir Alex Ferguson's a manager. His roles and limitations probably isn't to introduce sports psychology, but at the same time, it did bring them together as sort of a family, like you said, Elliot. Yeah, we could talk about the limitations and strengths for a long time, but Natasha, is there any strengths or limitations you would add to this?
So, strengths for PDMS, you've kind of got building the trust and connection. So you kind of had enhanced personal bonds, which I found from Lynch et al. 2003. So it promotes mutual understanding and emotional intimacy, which then allows individuals to connect on a deeper level. Another one would be emotional support and empathy. So mutual empathy, which was again found by Lynch et al. 2003, where you sell by sharing personal stories and where individuals can better understand each other and their emotional experiences, leading to increased empathy and emotional support. And then there is 2 limitations of PDMS, which I did find would link to this discussion. So you've got risk of vulnerability, where emotional exposure, so by sharing personal information, can leave individuals feeling vulnerable, especially if the other party is not as receptive and respectful, which was then founded by Warburton et al. 2004. And then you've also got judgment or rejection. So there's also a risk that the other person may not respond empathically and potentially lead into feelings of judgment, rejection, or exploitation. So there was that.
I think that nicely links to what Pete said about you're going to have to spend a lot of time with your group of people in order to avoid sort of that judgment and rejection. In terms of, you mentioned emotional vulnerability, how do you think potentially cultural differences within a team might affect the team dynamic or how effective PDMS would work?
So I feel like you do have to be careful around certain cultures, and then like, so say if you have like a different culture in someone and they're different, you kind of have to work your way around that and make sure it doesn't cause any harm or risk to that certain person. Because say if you say something wrong and you say it to that person, then they might feel a bit like they can't speak to you anymore. So that's kind of like the risk of vulnerability where you can't go out and say anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else have anything to add on sort of cultural differences? I know we had a conversation earlier about it.
We noticed that this study doesn't have, it's a very specific group, right? It's a team that's been working together and it's ice hockey. They don't report, I don't believe they report on the cultural background of the players, but it appears that like there might be certain situations where it doesn't work quite as well. Like the whole point of this intervention is that, oh, these players have had a sad background and so you want to play for them. But if you're in a sport maybe that's a little bit more well off, the players quite often well off, like Formula One or cricket, not going to end up with the same impact because the players don't have the same emotional past that maybe football players who've come from poorer areas might.
Absolutely.
Can I just add on to that? I think in terms of different cultures, obviously the whole point of this intervention is that you are emotionally vulnerable with each other and you like help increase communication or whatever. I think there are better ways to get to like know each other than just essentially saying an emotional story. So like if you wanted to share culture, you don't have to talk about something emotional that happens to you. It could be as easy as like one day like you bring in some food from your culture, or you like celebrate a holiday that one culture does and one culture doesn't, and you all do it together. I think there are better ways to celebrate culture than just telling each other emotional stories and having like an open form of communication in different ways that isn't having a lot of emotional vulnerability, which can potentially be triggering.
Yeah, I was going to ask you further about this, Sophie, but yeah, having other ways of sort of coming together and sharing something that's personal is definitely something that we could look at. So even sharing common goals, I think, would be a good way to sort of use theories of PDMS and sort of exploit the benefits of that. With sort of your knowledge as a sports psych, Sophie, with team cohesion and sort of your implementation of sort of your knowledge, what methods would you sort of, I know you touched upon it there a little bit, but what methods do you think we could sort of use instead?
I think, well, it very much depends on the team. Like you guys have said, how long they've been together, how long the psychologist has been working with them. I think the kind of way that the PDMS intervention like helps increase communication and getting to know each other, I think that's really good. But I think we can possibly use that open form of communication in different ways. So like I mentioned earlier, Madsen and Burns, they basically just did a questionnaire, a little debrief questionnaire at the end of every practice and the end of every game. And the participants found that they preferred getting feedback through those forms compared to feedback in like from their team members. I think that's beneficial as well, because instead of just sitting there and telling an emotional story, they're also evaluating training, they're evaluating the game. So it's like an added kind of, we're building team cohesion and we're also evaluating what happened in the session, and it just kind of, it's a good thing that works together. They also found that it kept them accountable. They found that they were able to understand what a good team is and they could then bring that further. So I think the intervention we've been talking about is good in the sense that communication's there and you get to know each other, but I think there are definitely ways that we can build team cohesion without being really emotionally vulnerable and potentially triggering. And I think things like questionnaires and team building activities are the way to go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an abundance of research to support your ideas as well. Has anyone else got any final comments for today?
I just have one more like cultural background thing. Again, different players from different countries probably react to group sharing in a different way because different countries will have different levels of like especially for male players, male openness about their emotions depends on your background. A lot of people are taught not to do this, so you've got to be very careful here with not causing any harm or forcing somebody to do something that they don't want to.
Yeah, absolutely. A really good discussion, guys. Thank you for listening and hope you enjoy. Okay.